Woe be unto him who opens one of the 7 gateways to hell, because through that gateway, evil will invade the world.
Valentine's Day is a curse that'll live on, and no one will know as the years come and go of the horror from long time ago. In this little town, when the 14th comes round, there's a silence and fear in the air. Remember the morn that the legend was born, all the shock and the horror was there. Oh, the legend, they say, on a Valentine's Day is a curse that'll live on, and no one will know as the years come and go of the horror from long time ago. And no one will know as the years come and go of the horror from long time ago.
Okay, I'm Dave Parker, and I'm here with Troy Howarth. We're here to talk about Black Cat, 1981 by Lucio Fulci. How's it going, Troy?
Good, good. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, Troy has worked pretty extensively on Fulci stuff and a bunch of other things. You want to let these people know what you did?
One of numerous books I've written is Splintered Visions, which is about Lucio Fulci and his films. I've done commentaries for, I don't know exactly how many, probably somewhere in the range of a dozen of his films, in a wide array of genres too. I mean, one of the things about Fulci was he was not just a horror guy. He worked in pretty much every genre you could name. So I've been able to cover a bunch of things, not just usual horror films, but other types of films he's done as well, sort of historical dramas and science fiction and things like that. So yeah, he's somebody that I have a great deal of affection for and a tremendous amount of respect for as a filmmaker. I think long underrated for many years, although these days I think most people are pretty much on the same page recognizing his talent.
Yeah, I think you're right here. So speaking of underrated, I think we're going to talk about probably one of his most underrated and underseen movies. Now, it's in a weird spot for Fulci in terms of where it came in his career, because everything else was a gore fest at this time. Although people have kind of said this one, no, it's not nearly as gory. It still has its moments of cruelty and gore in it. It's still a Fulci movie. It's just instead of, being City of the Living Dead or The Beyond, it's just something a little bit different. So we're talking about The Black Cat. It's his only Poe adaptation, but not his only film that involves any Poe stuff. I mean, a couple of his films do have Poe kind of dealings in there. And like every good Italian horror director, he has to take a stab at The Black Cat, right? So
yeah, well, I mean, Dario Argento did his later, a decade later, as a matter of fact, with his segment of Two Evil Eyes. So yeah, and of course Luigi Cozzi did a film called well, it's known by many titles, but Black Cat is one of them, which is perhaps not quite on the same tier as the other two.
Well, then you got Sergio Martino's. They say that Your Vice is the Locker Room and I Have the Key as a Black Cat, but that's kind of far pushing it as far as I remember. I like that movie, but it's been a while. I don't know if somebody get trapped in a bricked-in wall or something.
No, there are some elements that are closer, really, than even Fulci's. Fulci's film has nothing to do with Edgar Allan Poe at all. Martino's at least has the alcoholic protagonist, a cat that is maimed at one point, mutilated, has his eye cut out, and yeah, I mean, there are elements that are in there that at least acknowledge the kind of template of Poe's writing. Actually, in some respects, Fulci had done an earlier film, a giallo, called The Psychic, also known as Seven Notes in Black, Murder to the Tune of Seven Black Notes, which has very strong Poe elements as well, with being buried alive or walled up alive, and of course also City of the Living Dead has the premature burial aspect to it as well. So yeah, there's a lot of Poe in Italian sort of genre cinema, but that's not surprising because he's all over the map anyway, in terms of other countries as well. I mean, there are so many films called The Black Cat, and most of them have absolutely nothing to do with the story whatsoever.
I mean, we have a cat in this one. We have the bricked-in wall at the very ending. We have the symbol, the end of the story. The cat meows and lets the police know. That kind of stuff happens. And there's a fire that's in there. The wall, the burned cat on the wall is in the story as well. So I mean, there's vague similarities, but the whole psychic kind of connection with the cat is definitely something different. And it's funny, you did mention the psychic, and the ending of that one's just the darker version of this ending, of course, which I think that's probably I'd say his most underrated movie. It just kind of stayed with me, kind of haunting. That movie's pretty haunting, actually. This movie's much more fun than I remembered. This is one that it wasn't one that I would watch a lot, like Zombie or Beyond or Don't Torture a Duckling. It was one that I saw sparingly, and rewatching it was refreshing.
It was the first one I ever saw, long before I knew who he was, long before I knew what Italy was, for that matter. It used to run on USA Network. They used to have a program in the 80s called Saturday Nightmares, where they'd run a movie and usually an episode, the 1980s version of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and an episode of The Hitchhiker. That was your Saturday night lineup, and they ran a lot of Euro horror stuff on there. Actually, in hindsight, there were a lot of things that I saw there that were kind of significant in terms of my interests later on. But the Black Cat was one of them, and I've told this story before that as a kid, I didn't understand anything. Well, most kids wouldn't know this. To do with like the technical aspects of films and how films are sometimes shot in widescreen and they need to be cropped for TV. And this was the standard practice in the 80s and 90s before we have these wonderful, sophisticated new TVs where you don't have to have that anymore. Panning and scanning just doesn't happen much now. But in the 80s, seeing this film, I was always confused by the fact there were all these close-ups of people's eyes, and they were skinny. And what I came to realize later, looking back, and it was what they did with the TV version was, sooner than just sort of crop it dead center or crop it in such a way that you only saw one of the eyes, they squeezed it. And so the close-ups of the eyes, everybody's eyes were sort of really, squeezed like this, very strange kind of an effect. And of course, because, as you said before, it wasn't one of his real super gory films, it didn't really need to be heavily cut for TV. There's a little bit of nudity and a little bit of gore, but it's by and large, it plays very much like Fulci's attempt at kind of a Hammer film. That's how it feels like to me, in the same way that a movie like Baron Blood feels like Mario Bava's kind of crack at making a Hammer type film. It's one of those films that you could easily see Hammer or Amicus kind of producing in the 1970s, and that extends down to the central casting, the lead actor in the film.
Yeah, you mentioned the cropping. I was reading that, and that's very unfair for a lot of these movies being released on crappy releases and getting judged that way. But you mentioned the face being squeezed, and all I could think of, this is a little bit unrelated, is Little Face from Dick Tracy. It's just completely sucked in there.
Yeah.
And there's some funny thing about this, Fulci with the eyes, and there's so many eye close-ups in Italian horror in general, and Westerns, of course, but Fulci was pretty infamous for the eye trauma and eye close-ups.
Yeah.
This one actually had me laughing out loud just because I'm so used to the cliche, I guess, of Fulci, because we do Patrick Magee, Mimsy Farmer, and then we go to the Black Cat. I just started laughing.
Eyes, lots of eyes.
It was just like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly with the Black Cat, and I was just like, okay, it just got silly to the point. Although I really do like the movie, but that part was just a bit much of the close-up of the cat's eyes in that kind of trio going around.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you go back to the 60s, before Fulci became connected with horror films, he started off making comedies and musicals pretty much. That was what he did most of the 60s, and then he gradually started introducing like Westerns, and he did his first Giallo at the end of the 60s, one on top of the other, a perversion story. But he did a series of films with an insanely popular pair of Sicilian comics, Franco Franchi and Ciccio and Garcia. Franco and Ciccio. And Franco and Ciccio were a major, major phenomenon in Italy. These were films that parodied everything conceivable, from James Bond to Giallo to Westerns, you name it, they did a parody in some form or another, made an insane number of movies in the 60s and 70s, very, very few of which were ever released in the U.S. Because comedy is one of those, it's hard to translate. So much of their humor was very topical, and it was very much based in Italian sort of culture and politics, but it was also a lot of wordplay and dialects. This is the important thing to understand too. It's not enough to say Italian, but there are different regions in Italy, different dialects. Neapolitans talk very differently from Romans, for example. And a lot of that sort of sophisticated wordplay and stuff is completely, you can't dub it. It's just impossible. So a lot of that stuff never came out over here, but Fulci directed a lot of their films in the 60s. And the reason I bring it up is that one of the films that he directed is a film that, in its title, spoofs Sergio Leone. It's called The Long, the Short, and the Cat. Well, it's like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And it deals with Franco and Ciccio being servants to this eccentric old woman who dies, leaves everything to her cat. And if anything should happen to the cat, within a certain amount of time, they're not going to have access to the money. So they have to desperately try and keep this cat happy and keep it safe and everything else. It's actually a funny little movie, and it anticipates some of these elements. And that movie was from around, I think it was made in '66. So, good number of years before. It's funny to see some of these elements kind of creeping in gradually, even in something like that, a comedy, that assumes a different significance when you look at the later movies.
Yeah. As far as this movie's cast too, it's a really good mixture. I mean, of course, they got the big, like you mentioned, Patrick Magee being in here. He would have probably been in he's in a number of Amicus, I believe. Yeah, he's in a couple of those, and only one Hammer, Demons of the Mind.
Yes.
But Magee's a great actor, and this was one of his last years actually being active, maybe his last year in general, in film at least. And he did 3 horror films this year, and all 3 are all good performances, bizarre films too. This one, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Miss Osborne, where he plays kind of like the soldier type, the general, I think. And then he plays a ghoul in, is that a Roy Ward Baker Monster Club? Yeah, I love that movie. That's a very fun movie. And he plays the ghoul, one of the ghouls, when they go to Stuart Whitman in that one.
Stuart Whitman. Yeah, that's the best segment of that movie, I think, by far.
Hands down.
It's really legitimately creepy. It's often called an Amicus film. It wasn't. Amicus was dead by then, but the guy that produced it, Milton Subotsky, was half of Amicus, so it's easy to see why they say that. He did another one, I don't know if it was the same year, it might have been the year after, called Sleep of Death, for a director named Calvin Floyd, who directed what is to date the most faithful version of Frankenstein, a movie called Terror of Frankenstein, from 1977, I believe, which was an Irish, British, Swedish co-production. But it's very faithful to the book. But he did this film. It's based on loosely on the writings of Sheridan Le Fanu, the writer responsible for Carmilla. And it's called Sleep of Death, and Patrick Magee is in that as well, along with a few other familiar faces. So, I mean, he definitely had his horror credentials, but he was not the first casting for the role of Robert Miles in Black Cat. The original casting was Peter Cushing. Peter Cushing had accepted the part and was in the process of, as was his tendency, going through the script and making heavy notations and drawing little sketches, what he thought his character should look like, and, costumes and things like that. And, it was funny because he made a special note in the script, because he was an animal lover, about, there must be somebody on the set at all times, from the animal protection, to make sure that, nothing bad happens. I don't know how that would have gone over, although Fulci could be rough on actors, but I don't think he certainly wasn't Ruggero Deodato. He doesn't have that history of cannibal movies and stuff like that. So I don't think that there were ever anything untoward happened to the cat on this film. But he had signed to do the film, but then he got offered a really plum supporting part in a TV version of A Tale of Two Cities, which starred Chris Sarandon, about 5 years prior to playing Jerry Dandridge in Fright Night. So he bailed. He decided, he was at a stage in his career where the idea of doing a Charles Dickens adaptation was more appealing to him than doing an Italian horror movie. So he bailed. The second choice was Donald Pleasence, who was going to do it, but he was working on a film directed by David Hemmings. Speaking of other actors associated with Italian horror films, David Hemmings was directing a movie in either Australia or New Zealand. I can't remember. It was called The Race of the Yankee Zephyr, but it ran over budget and ran over schedule, and Pleasance couldn't get there when he was needed. I've heard a rumor that he then tried to get Richard Johnson, who, of course, we will remember for playing Dr. Maynard in Zombie. And he's also in the Monster Club. Speaking of which, he plays the vampire in the
with
comedy
Donald Pleasance.
With Donald Pleasance.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it all connects together. I don't know if that's really true or not, but I've heard that rumor that they tried to get him and it didn't work out. So Patrick Magee was selected. And Patrick Magee, at this stage in his life, you'd be forgiven for thinking he was probably in his 70s. He wasn't even 60. He was one of those guys who, his hair went white prematurely, so he always looked older. But he was a heavy drinker. That's very well known. Actually, if you ever get the Blu-ray of the restored director's cut of Dementia 13, Francis Ford Coppola does a commentary on it, and he tells some very funny stories about Patrick Magee literally falling down drunk in the hotel where they were staying. So Magee was a great theater actor. He was very well known for appearing in plays by Samuel Beckett and Harold Pinter. A really just one of a kind actor, and he was one of the relatively few actors that Stanley Kubrick used more than once in significant roles in his films. He didn't tend to use actors more than once, certainly not major leading parts. Occasionally you'd have somebody like a Philip Stone or a Joe Turkel who played small parts. But Patrick Magee plays, famously plays the writer who gets crippled in Clockwork Orange, and he also plays the Chevalier in Barry Lyndon. And he's wonderful in both. And talk about contrasting performances. I mean, Kubrick really encouraged him to go to like level 13 in Clockwork Orange. He's extremely over the top in that film, whereas he's very subdued in Barry Lyndon. So you get the full sweep of Magee's talent there. What an incredible voice, incredible eyes. And you can see why he did so many big close-ups on him. But Magee at that stage was not well. He was pretty much on his last legs. Apparently his daughter was there with him to kind of help him through the shoot, and he was rather difficult to work with. But Fulci had a lot of respect for him. He didn't always respect actors, but he respected Magee, and he said, it wasn't easy working with him, but the results were absolutely worth it. So, part of me is kind of like, it would have been so fascinating to see super genteel, gentlemanly Peter Cushing in a Fulci movie.
Yeah.
Talk about contrasting personalities. I mean, Cushing, who would wear white gloves so as not to stain his fingers while smoking cigarettes, and would always, kiss the ladies by the hand, and very gentlemanly and not at all crass and vulgar. And Fulci, who was incredibly vulgar. I mean, that would have been very interesting, but I don't think he would have been any better than Magee. No. And quite frankly, I don't think he would have been as good, because Magee had this extraordinary screen presence. And as we say, he was nearly dead by this time. I mean, by 1982, I think is the year that he died, he was only 60. You wouldn't think it. I mean, you would have thought he was a lot older than that, but boy, sure. What an actor.
So, I mean, he didn't look any different from he does in the Price Poe one he was in, the Red Death. He doesn't look any different in that one than he does in this one. And that's what, 20 years? 20 years?
No, it was 63. They shot at 63, I believe. So, going on 20 years. Yeah. No, he looked very much the same. I mean, if you go back to the early 60s and see him in he was all over the map. I mean, he did low budget horror movies, but he was also, he worked with William Friedkin, he worked with Kubrick, he worked with Joseph Losey. So he's in all kinds of different things. But he did pretty much look the same. I mean, through it all, you couldn't mistake him for anybody else.
See, you mentioned Sleep at Death, and that was listed on as 1980 on Internet Movie Database. I don't know when it was released. I watched it for 1980, but the thing is, it's kind of a slow movie, a VHS rip, not a particularly great quality. So it's not ringing a bell too much. Is that the one where there's a scene in the graveyard where he's reading the grave? And she's supposed to be, I do remember that. I barely remember him in that movie. It needs a nice remaster, because that movie is probably not easy to judge on the quality.
Well, it's a tough movie to see altogether. That's another one that used to run on USA, funnily enough, on Saturday Nightmares, and probably the copies that are floating around may even be taken from a TV version. I'm not sure. It's a strange film. Calvin Floyd also, in addition to doing Terror of Frankenstein, he did a documentary with Christopher Lee called In Search of Dracula, which is a lot of fun, which is also out on Blu-ray. But Sleep of Death, it also has Kurt Jurgens, who played the villain in The Spy Who Loved Me and was in a variety of great films, and Marilu Tolo, who was in films for Mario Bava and Dario Argento. She was Dario Argento's partner for a period of time, as a matter of fact, in the early 70s. So it has an interesting cast. It definitely has cult value. And I'd like to think somebody at some point, I mean, look at some of the movies that are getting releases, and it's like, give that one if you can find it. I don't know, I don't know who owns the rights and what the elements are like and so forth, but I'd like to see a much better version to really properly assess it.
Yeah. As far as putting Cushing in this role, I love Peter Cushing, but Patrick Magee is just more intimidating. Peter Cushing's not intimidating. I as much as he is, I mean, even in Corruption, like he's weird, but he just never gets that. He's got that timidness. And you mentioned him with the putting the white gloves on there, which is very funny because Fulci's known for just the tobacco pipe and just falling, ripping it, burning his shirt. So it's just like, it's yin and yang there.
Cushing could be frighteningly nasty and intense in some films, like
the Frankenstein films.
Yes, I was going to say that. It's funny because, Cushing is so beloved by a lot of people, and they kind of, frankly, they lay it on a bit thick sometimes, calling him St. Peter and everything. He was a human being like the rest of us. He had his flaws and he had his faults, but he was a great actor and by all accounts, a nice man. He an eccentric in some respects, little odd, but definitely a nice, warm, kind of friendly person. But because he's so well loved by so many people, they tend to make excuses for Baron Frankenstein, like, oh, he's a force for good. No, he's not. He's a complete sociopathic, murdering bastard. Yeah, he rapes the girl in Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. In the first film, he's had an affair with the maid and he has her killed when she says she's pregnant with his child. So he's a nasty piece of work the whole way through.
He calls his old professor so he can use his brain. I mean,
he pushes him off the balcony. No, he's
the most evil performance he ever played.
He's in a couple of them, like especially Evil Frankenstein, which was kind of a reboot. They do make him more heroic in that film, and Frankenstein Created Woman, he's maybe a little bit nicer. But the other movies, especially Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. I mean, he could be, and also another film he did for Hammer called Twins of Evil, where he plays a sort of Puritan witch hunter. He's frightening in that film, so he could play really nasty parts, but it's a different kind of personality, and I suspect he would have brought that kind of gentility to it, which could have been interesting. But I really like what Patrick Magee brings to it, because Magee is there's something otherworldly about him. Again, there's no mistaking him for anybody else. He's a completely unique screen presence, that voice, and thank goodness he was able to do his own dubbing for this, because that would have been a terrible loss if he would have been revoiced. And that's one reason that this movie absolutely needs to be watched in English instead of Italian, because you don't want to lose that voice.
Yeah, and I mean, like, he also got other people speaking. I think Warbeck, he's speaking in English. He dubbed his own voice. I think that's his own voice there.
That's his voice. It was shot in English. I mean, not all of these films were, but a lot of them were, especially the ones, if they had an eye towards export, because the Italian films didn't tend to do great business at the Italian box office. They tended to do better overseas, especially in English language terrain. So they tended to try and shoot in English or some form of English. This was definitely shot in English. David Warbeck, that is his voice. Mimsy Farmer, that's her voice. So the three leads, that's their voices on the soundtrack.
So thinking about this, a lot of Fulci's movies take place in different countries, and I don't remember any movie taking place in Britain for Fulci. I might be mistaken. Is one on top of the other? I can't think.
No, Lizard and a Woman. A Lizard in a Woman's Skin was shot in London, and that's a brilliant film. Well, the Psychic is largely set partially in England. But yeah, this is probably his most English movie, in the sense that you get a certain amount of kind of dubbed core blimey English accents going on in that, and not being English, I don't know, but I've heard people who are English talking about the film and say it is such a strange, weird view of England that you get in films like this, and also Jorge Grau's movie The Living Dead of Manchester Morgue, where you can tell it's, and I would imagine probably also true of like Polanski's Repulsion as well, in particular, these movies that are made by foreigners, set in England, but obviously through kind of a different perspective.
That's always unique when that happens. What's that director from? He's got to be from India, maybe Jag Mutar. I can't think of his actual full name, but he did a couple movies in the States, Open House and Hack-A-Lamp. Yeah. And they are just absurdly weird. Like, he doesn't understand Halloween. He doesn't understand like selling houses, and they just have a certain charm to them. Like, I would never be like, they're great, and I would never say I like to laugh at them. I'm just intrigued by them and enjoy them. So it's similar to that somewhat.
Joe D'Amato did a film called Absurd, which is very well named. And there's that wonderful scene in Absurd where everybody's gathered around to watch football on TV, and they're all eating big bowls. the Super Bowl, and they're all eating big bowls of spaghetti, which is very American. So you have to laugh at that.
That's the best part of that. So
Yeah.
Mimsy Farmer, she's really good in this. I mean, I think she does better performances in Four Flies and even like Road to Selena, but she's just got a great unhinged personality. Every movie I've seen her in, she has a certain unhinged quality to the point where I always suspect her because I think that she's personally mad in every movie. So this one, she's a little bizarre. She's a little unique. She's definitely got that neurotic thing going on, but she's good in this. She's also gorgeous. She's got a great look.
Yeah, she's an interesting screen presence. I like her. She's got a kind of brittle, icy quality to her that's a little different than somebody like Catriona MacColl, for example, who was starring in Fulci's other horror films at this time. And I've often wondered what it would have been like if he would have put Catriona MacColl in that part instead. I don't know if that idea ever occurred to him or not, but it would make for a different experience. There is something very kind of offbeat about her, very eccentric, which I think works well in tandem with Patrick Magee. So it gives the whole film a slightly off kilter kind of quality.
And of course, we got David Warbeck, who went on to do The Beyond. A great actor, good screen presence, better performance in The Beyond. But like your book says and stuff, he just didn't have much to do in here. He still does his best.
No, he's fine. I mean, he was a New Zealander. Magee was Irish, and Mimsy Farmer's American. He was a New Zealander who ended up in England for a period of time. He did some low budget films in England. He did a couple of films for Freddie Francis. There was Craze with Jack Palance and Trog, the infamous Trog with Joan Crawford. He's in those. He was in a very unusual movie for Russ Meyer called Black Snake, a very atypical Russ Meyer film. He was the star in that. And kind of gradually worked his way over to Italy. He started off his first Italian film, I believe, unless there was one before it that I can't remember, but he certainly was in Fistful of Dynamite or Duck You Sucker for Sergio Leone in the flashback sequences with James Coburn. And loved working in Italy and did a ton of movies over there during that period of time where Italian films were just kind of, getting cranked out left and right. And he did a bunch of them. He worked with Lenzi. He worked with Fulci, he worked with Margheriti, and always had a great time making those films. I mean, he was in some terrible ones, but he was also in some really good ones. And
Miami
he
Golem.
always, Miami Golem, which was Alberto De Martino's last film. Unfortunately, after that, he said he'd had enough. Warbeck was always a little bit unfair towards Black Cat. He said, The Beyond, everything just came together, whereas the Black Cat didn't work. And I don't agree with that. I think Black Cat's much better than it gets credit for, but it certainly isn't a big fan favorite in the way that Beyond is.
Yeah, and then again, the last, I mean, there's a couple other tiny names in here. I recognize the kind of supposed pervert from Don't Torture a Duckling. And then, of course, the one guy, the drunk, he's just a character actor that I've seen in a bunch
Bruno
of stuff.
Corazzari.
Yeah.
Bruno Corazzari, he was, he worked also with Mario Bava. He worked with Lenzi. I mean, he's in a ton of Italian films.
If I remember.
A lot of Eurocrime, yeah. He did like The Cynic, The Rat, and the Fist, for example, for Lenzi. He's one of those very familiar faces. And, Al Cliver, of course, Al Cliver.
Gotta go with Al Cliver.
One of Fulci's kind of recurring players during this period. They started working together on Zombie, and he's dubbed on the English track by the same actor on both Zombie and Black Cat, Nick Alexander. So you'd be forgiven for thinking that's what Al Cliver really sounded like, but no, not at all. He's dubbed. And he would go on to do a bunch of other films for Fulci as late as Touch of Death and Demonia going into the 1990s. So he's in there. And it's and Dagmar Lassander.
Oh, yeah. She's House
Dagmar
by the Cemetery.
Lassander. Yeah. She went on to do House by the Cemetery. She'd been in Hatchet for the Honeymoon for Mario Bava. She'd been in all kinds of movies. Very beautiful woman, very interesting screen presence. Al Cliver, you wouldn't necessarily think it to look at him in these later Fulci films, but earlier he'd been kind of a very much sort of chiseled pretty boy kind of a presence. He had a very kind of torrid love affair with Annie Bell, for a period of time. Annie Bell was absolutely gorgeous woman, and who was in a lot of erotic type films. She's in House by the House on the Edge of the Park for Deodato. She has the kind of pixie haircut.
Short hair.
Apparently, according to David Warbeck, Dagmar Lassander was very taken with Al Cliver during the making of this film, and at one point they ended up sleeping together. And Warbeck said, "Why? I thought you couldn't stand her." And he said, "Well, it seemed like the quickest way to get her to shut up." So, apparently she was pursuing him rather openly during the shoot. On the whole, it was. By all accounts, a pretty smooth shoot. Fulci did have his difficulties, as I mentioned, with Patrick Magee. But Magee was, he was a pro. He was there and, did his job, and everything turned out well. Warbeck did not particularly like Mimsy Farmer, though. He said he found her rather off-putting. But other than that, he remembered Patrick Magee with a great deal of fondness.
Also a strange thing here. We don't have your typical Fabio Frizzi, or we have Pino Donaggio, which is crazy. I didn't remember that. So I was like, oh, this score is interesting. It's a good score. The opening, it's really good with the cat.
It's a great score.
And then I was like, Pino Donaggio. I was like, what in the world? So every once in a while, he pops up scoring these bizarre films.
Well, he also scores The Black Cat for Dario Argento later on. He's a composer like Ennio Morricone who bounces from big films to little films with tremendous ease. He does films for Charles Band's production company. He does films for Brian De Palma. He's all over the place. This is his only time working with Fulci. I don't know if they collaborated very closely or not. I have no idea. Fulci, wasn't always deeply involved in the scoring of his films. Certain films he was, other films maybe not. But it's a great score, and unfortunately, it's never been officially released. Although I did find a bootleg years ago, taken from the master tapes, so I do have the score. But I'd like it to be cleaned up and released and made available. That would be really nice. It's a really beautiful score.
One of the interesting things I noticed about this movie actually is, so Fulci's no stranger to kind of like hating on overly superstitious people or punishing superstitious people. And this one is kind of bizarre because we have a guy who he's upset at the small superstitious backwoods kind of like town, hating him for communicating with the dead. So therefore his angry thoughts he puts psychically through the cat, and the cat carries out the crimes, but then the cat gets the better of it. Yeah, this is the plot, guys. So the cat gets the better of him and starts picking off people on its own accord. That's kind of what's going on. But it's the Poe kind of story? Is it the madness of him or the cat or both, or whatever? Who knows? I mean, it's good, but it's just kind of a different take on his superstition in films. Like, that's my favorite part of Fulci's kind of things, like is motifs that pop up, I guess, is the superstitious aspects in his films and the kind of backwoods mentality that a lot of times Ungodly Warlock, The Beyond, all this stuff. Don't Torture a Duckling, it's the most in.
Well, yeah. I mean, he was very much a leftist, and he had tremendous sympathy for kind of the disenfranchised. And so very often in his movies, you have characters who are rather tragic, who are just kind of victimized because they're different. They're outsiders. Think of Bob in City of the Living Dead, for example, and Machara, the witch, the so-called witch in Don't Torture a Duckling. Deeply distrustful of the organized kind of religion and the power structures and so forth. And it's an element that's very interesting in his films. I mean, on a surface level, I don't think people really took that very seriously for a long time. And then you realize, looking at the movies more seriously and more sympathetically, that there is a real kind of thematic through line that goes through these movies, and there is a real kind of thought process that went into it. So it's not all just about shock effects.
Yeah, I just thought that was an aspect I never picked up on the first time. Of course, I like the point of view, and the small town definitely, you said, reminds me of a Hammer film. It's like, and Let Sleeping Corpses Lie is a great comparison. People have compared those two. So it's not like your typical swinging, 60s or 70s London kind of deal. It's definitely kind of the small kind of town, drinking in the pub, which is kind of fun. I just watched for the first time Arnold, which got put out by Vinegar Syndrome, and that had kind of the small town feel. And that was really great. I really enjoyed that. I noticed similarities right away to that. And so I guess it's not too far off. I mean, Is there anything else you want to discuss? Maybe connect it. Oh, there's another actress in here who plays basically the victim in 3 or 4 Fulci
Yeah, the
movies,
victim, Daniela Doria. Beautiful, doe-eyed Daniela Doria, and the most horrible things happened to her. Fulci apparently really liked her, and she liked him. That wasn't always the case. There were some actors and actresses who loathed him. But she really liked him, and he liked her. He said, she's just such a champ. She does whatever, is required. She barfs up her intestines in City of the Living Dead. She is horrifically mutilated and murdered in The New York Ripper. The most infamous scene in that film, I think, even worse than the bottle up the vagina murder scene in that film. I mean, she's really put through the ringer in that, and comes to a bad end in the prologue of House by the Cemetery as well. She never really had much to do, unfortunately. I think her biggest part was New York Ripper, where at least she has a few scenes. But, for the most part, she pretty much just shows up to die really, really horribly. So in this movie, it's kind of the, I guess, the tip of the hat, the lip service to the slasher movement in the film, where the young couple goes off for a little lovemaking in a secluded location, and it ends up going very badly for them. So she's not as horrifically dispatched in this as she is in some of the other films, but it's still pretty unpleasant with the frothing at the mouth and all that stuff. Probably the grisliest sequence would have to be the fire scene. That's probably as rough as the movie gets, although, compared to a lot of the other movies, no, it's not that much. And I don't have a problem with that. And I think it's unfortunate that film and Manhattan Baby's another one, although it's not nearly as good. But it is an interesting film, too. It's got some really good stuff in it. And they don't tend to get talked about as much, I think, because they're not really gory films. You got to bear in mind, he makes Zombie. After that, he makes a Poliziesco called Contraband, which is incredibly violent.
Yeah.
Then City of the Living Dead, and then this. And then right after this, he does The Beyond. So it's like this kind of run of really gruesome, upfront violent films. And here's this kind of throwback. It's a little bit more like an English Gothic from the 1960s. So it's kind of out of step with the times, but I'm glad that he did it. It showed that he could do it very well. And I think the movie, now that we can see it in a good quality edition, and no more either squeezed eyeballs or just close-ups of the bridges of noses. That's how it looked on VHS. The old Bingo VHS was horrible. I mean, it was just cut right, the peripheries were all cut off, so it was just like close-ups of people's noses. So, we can appreciate it now. And it's also another person worth mentioning, Sergio Savati, the cinematographer, who was shooting pretty much all of Fulci's films during this run. He shot Zombie, Contraband, City of the Living Dead, this one, House by the Cemetery, The Beyond. Some of his best-looking films, and even earlier, they had gone back all the way to the 1970s with films like For the Apocalypse and Silver Saddle and The Psychic. Great cinematographer, and
one of the best.
Really, really tremendous-looking movie. So, yeah, it's got all that going for it, and I hope that people who can kind of see past the fact that it's not a bloodbath can appreciate it a little bit better. I mean, the script has its problems. It has its peculiarities. It doesn't entirely hang together, but the mood and atmosphere are very much on point. And if you like Patrick McGee, as I do, I mean, it's just, pardon the expression, it's catnip.
Yeah, and it does have some Poe connections. It does feel a bit Poe. It's not completely far off. I guess if you take all those Italian Poe adaptations, you'd get one close. If you take the little bits, and you got Stuart Gordon even did one. So, I mean, so many people did them. And then you got the American ones, too, besides the Gordon one.
You can go back to the 1934 Black Cat with Karloff and Lugosi, which has absolutely nothing to do with Poe, but yet it captures the spirit perfectly. It really does capture the atmosphere. And then, Corman did his kind of version of Black Cat in Tales of Terror. As you mentioned, Stuart Gordon did his, which is a very interesting take. Dario Argento is his closest in many respects. It's the one that really kind of comes closest to the story. But what he does in his version is also work in a ton of references, little references, big references to other Edgar Allan Poe stories. I mean, you can tell he's a fanatic. So it's just loaded with all kinds of weird and wonderful references. Fulci's film is not quite in that vein, but it does. I think it manages to capture the flavor well enough.
As far as other, I guess this is bizarre because it's not really an animals attacks movie. I mean, it is a killer cat, but I guess it's more like the cat from the Uncanny or something. It's not really an all-out killer cat movie. So it's kind of hard to put this in there and compare it to the other killer animal movies. There was a handful, of course, Venom, which we covered, which is also not a traditional killer animal movie. And we have Savage Harvest, which is Alliance, which is an okay TV movie. It's okay.
Yeah.
And you know what? Piranha 2, The Spawning, which I think it was made in the time dates on that one are all messed up. There's a couple more. I guess Wolfen you could count somewhat, but again, not traditional either. No real traditionals except Savage Harvest, I don't think.
I think you're right. I mean, that run was kind of specific from the mid to late 70s, really, more than anything. I mean, it goes back at least as far as The Birds in 63, but it really kind of becomes popular again thanks to Jaws, which comes out in 75. And then after that, you have, like the William Girdler films and things like that are evoking that, let's say, but, very entertainingly so. So by the early 80s, we've kind of moved on to other things. I mean, this is kind of the period slashers are becoming really popular.
Yeah,
so
big time.
It's not really I wouldn't say it's really an animal attack movie. Fulci never really did one of those, although, the cat does, do a little bit of damage here and there, like when it attacks David Warbeck at one point. So get a little bit of animal attack action at least.
Yeah, as far as Fulci's other two movies this year, it's so hard to compare them because House by the Cemetery and The Beyond are such like heavy hitting classics that I'm just like, like any other director having 3 movies of that caliber in a year, I can't believe people don't talk about it. Can you imagine having 3 movies that good in 1 year? 3 horror movies?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, the Black Cat is, they're all released in this same time frame. Black Cat was made in 80, but it comes out in 81, and he does those, and then afterwards he does New York Ripper, which is a much more divisive film, but I think a great one, a misunderstood one, I would argue. And really when you go back and think about it, I mean, track it back before that, you have Contraband and City of the Living Dead and Zombie and go back Silver Saddle, The Psychic. I mean, it's a really great run of films that he does over a period of several years. It kind of gets broken a little bit with Manhattan Baby, which is not a great film, although again, I think it's got good things in it and I find it entertaining enough. And then after that, things start to get a little bit ropier and kind of all over the place. But I mean, he continued to do really good work up until the end. I'm not going to argue they're all great films. He made a couple of bad films here and there.
Who did?
Fulci. Yeah.
No, I said who didn't make a couple bad films,
Oh, who didn't? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said who. Yeah, who didn't? Well, I mean, very few directors I can point to. I mean, Jean-Pierre Melville never made a bad film. Polanski, I don't think he's made a bad film. I don't know that I'd say that. I don't think Romero ever made a really bad film. Made a couple weaker ones, but I don't think any of them were really bad. But for the most part, especially if you're prolific as he was, and you're, he left behind, 50 some films. That's a lot of films over a period of 30 plus years. So I think it's a pretty remarkable body of work on the whole. It's unfortunate in a way that the gore stuff has become so. That's what people want to talk about all the time. And I think he was frustrated by that to a certain extent. He used to say, everybody always used to call my art shit. Now people want to call my shit art. And I don't think that wasn't the stuff he really wanted to do. That wasn't the stuff if you want to see what Fulci really cared about, what he really loved, look at films like Beatrice Cenci from 1969 or Don't Torture a Duckling from 1972. Those are films that he was really proud of. But it was to his benefit that it happened because it enabled him to be able to continue through the rest of his career, remaining more or less steadily employed, even though he had a lot of health problems and so forth. But he didn't suffer in the way that some of his contemporaries did because they didn't have kind of defined careers. But everybody associated him all of a sudden with making horror movies. It kind of enabled him to keep making movie after movie after movie. And a lot of those later films, I think, are a lot better than they get credit for.
Yeah, I can't think of any I really truly dislike, except I don't care for Door in the Silence. But I think we've had that conversation before. I like Voices from Beyond. I don't care for Door in the Silence.
I don't mind Door of Silence. I don't like Demonia or Ghosts of Sodom. Those are pretty poor, I think. But I mean, hey, I mean, and maybe you haven't seen all the earlier films. I don't know, but of all the films you have seen, that's not bad to say. Well, I don't like this one.
Yeah,
that's okay. I mean, it's not like saying, I mean, a director I love, like Jess Franco. I love Jess Franco, but Franco made a lot of really rotten films.
Those any jungle film from Franco is not good.
No, it's not his. And he didn't care, and it showed. But you accept the bad with the good and so forth, and that's just the way it is with directors in general. I mean, I was thinking before of other directors. I mean, Orson Welles never directed a bad film, but there are a lot of great directors who've made bad films, and it doesn't mean you got to turn in your fan club badge to say, I think Dracula 3D is a piece of shit. I mean, it's okay. I still love Dario Argento. I forgive him. I don't feel he owes me anything. But yeah, I mean, it's rare for somebody as prolific and productive as Fulci was. And if you look at that full body of work, he was very busy. He was cranking out movies left and right during certain years of his life. Very, very busy indeed. It's a really consistent body of work, I'd say.
Yeah, I think that as far as his films are concerned, I just wish people would start with the gore stuff like I did. Like, I mean, Zombie is such a big title. It's such an eye-catching poster. People see it like, what is like Dawn of the Dead? So what's this zombie? I'll check it out. They like it. They see the Beyond, and then hopefully they move back to Don't Torture a Duckling and give that a spot, because that you get into the big mainstream Italian horror, demon, zombie, Deep Red, and then you kind of move Suspiria. You start moving into the more kind of weird gialli, and then before you know it, you're sitting there watching weird subgenres of movies you never thought you'd enjoy, and you're sitting there watching them. That's how it kind of worked for me, at least. Just introduced, and then before long you're trying to watch everything.
Yeah, I mean, when I did my book on Fulci, which, oh God, I mean, that was almost 10 years ago that I wrote it. One of the things I really wanted to do was pay attention to his full scope of his body of work, because I felt like other attempts had kind of glossed over a lot of the films, and I don't think it's fair to do that. Even if you're not a big fan of like the comedies and the musicals and things like that, you should still kind of try to dissect them a little bit and give them their due. And so that's what I tried to do in my book, was to not just focus on the popular, the big gore movies that everybody knows and everybody talks about. Let's talk about the other types of films that he did too. And I mean, really, again, he dabbled in just about every genre you can think of, and I don't think he was defeated by any of them. He always managed to find an interesting twist on any genre he worked in.
Yeah, I can't think of any I truly dislike, honestly. Like I said, Door in the Silence, I'd give it another shot, though. I'd give it another try when inevitably 7 or somebody puts out the Blu-ray. I'll buy it, and I'll watch it. It'll happen.
It'll happen.
That's a film mirage, isn't it?
It's a film mirage, and to be fair to Fulci didn't want to make that film. It was based on a short story that he had written, and Joe D'Amato, who was the head of Film Mirage, loved the story and really thought, he was convinced this movie was going to be like a big art house type thing, and it was going to win prizes. And Fulci was like, "It's a guy driving around in a car. Why do you want to make this?" But he did it. He did the best job that he could with it. I find it interesting as a kind of like, it's a very minimalist experience. It is kind of like an overextended Twilight Zone. I don't disagree, but it's I don't know. I find it easy viewing. It doesn't bother me.
I think everybody else I was talking to liked it, and I was just like, "How are you guys crazy? It's just John Savage doing this."
Just drive around in a car, and it is true. It is, but and it was the only time that he used a pseudonym on one of his films, and unfortunately, it was his last movie. But he wasn't particularly, he couldn't understand it. But I mean, D'Amato wanted to make it. The money was there. Okay, I'll make it. I don't get it. I don't understand why you think this. But D'Amato apparently really thought this was going to be like a prestige type thing, and it just didn't work out. And the movie was barely distributed, of course. So The Film Mirage library is getting a fair amount of representation on Blu-ray, so I think it's only a matter of time until somebody upgrades Door to Silence.
Pretty patchy film library, I will say, but entertaining nonetheless. What was the first one? Was Stage Fright, right? I love Stage Frights. Is their best, probably, in the whole library.
I don't know if that was their first production. I have a feeling they made more before that, but it was certainly, well, that's the best one. I mean, you know, that was the only movie that Soave directed for him, and that's a really, really good film. You know, and I'm fond of a lot of them. I mean, even they're not great films, but you know, some of the movies like Beyond Dark, not Beyond the Darkness, the D'Amato film, but Beyond Darkness.
Fragasso, I find.
Fragasso, I think it's an entertaining enough movie, and Ghost House by Lenzi, and you know, they're enjoyable. They all have this kind of weird, soft focus, kind of slightly dreamy quality to them it's the dying gasp, it's the death rattle of a period of film that we're never going to get back to. So there's a certain nostalgia value to that.
Yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to plug before we get out of here? Any last words on Fulci, Black Cat?
No, I mean, again, I would encourage anybody who, you know, if you saw Black Cat years ago, when you were kind of, you know, high off of the fumes of movies like The Beyond and New York Ripper and whatnot, you thought it was boring, maybe give it another shot. You might be surprised, pleasantly surprised by how good it is. You know, as far as Fulci's concerned, you could do worse. You might do better, but you certainly could do worse than to read my book on Fulci, Splintered Visions. It is available on Amazon. And if you found any of this interesting to listen to, you can hear me rapiding on about a lot of his films. I've done commentaries for, just off the top of my head, there are others, but Don't Torture a Duckling, Zombie, House by the Cemetery, New York Ripper, Enigma, you know, and The Psychic and others. So you can certainly listen to me talk about those movies in depth on their various different Blu-ray and, in some cases, 4K editions.
I appreciate it. I know Troy will be back for a couple more of these episodes, maybe with some more guests too, as well. We'll have to schedule those. We'll get to them as soon as we can. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.
No luck. I didn't want to. I didn't want to kill. I was forced to by this diabolical beast. He has had his revenge on me. He always hated me. And now he has won.